Welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Gerard Younger, and in today's video, I'm going to be going over an intriguing topic, which is building a custom gaming computer. Now, I do want to share that I've been building computers for a very long time. I built my first system around 2011, and I actually have footage of it. Took pictures of the actual build, but I've pretty much stuck with it ever since. I built another machine in 2014, and then I built another system in 2019, which I still have today. But all of that to say is I've pretty much been able to discover a baseline process that I like to follow whenever I build a computer that I want to go ahead and share with you all in today's video. So if you're interested, stay tuned. So when I'm building a machine, I typically use a set of tools or items to build a system. And one of the primary ones that I'll use is a motorized screwdriver. Now, the one that I have here is a battery powered one. And the reason why I'll use a motorized one, because there's a lot of parts inside of a system that have to be physically screwed down. And that puts a lot of physical stress on your wrists. But with this, you can do that with a press of a button. And that just makes it a little bit more easier to build a system. Now, I would advise against getting a very high powered one, because what could potentially happen is if you're building a machine with a high powered one, and for example, you're trying to screw a screw down into your board, you can easily rear off course and start to knock off chips on the motherboard, which is something that you would not want to do, because that would be considered physical damage, and a lot of manufacturers do not cover that. And unfortunately, you would be responsible for replacing that component out of pocket. However, there is a secondary screwdriver that I use, one that's not battery powered, and this would just be a standard one. It's a set, it comes with a bunch of bits, and usually you'll just need a Phillips head and a flathead when you're doing a computer build, but you never know, you might run into a bit that you may need, so having a set is very useful. But this one is the safer option, so if you don't feel comfortable with the motorized screwdriver, having one that's just standard that you have to physically turn on your own is perfectly fine. This will get the job done too. I usually use this to get into the harder to fit places when I'm building a machine, because the battery powered one, it may be harder to get in certain areas, so having one that's smaller that you could physically turn is really nice. They also have ones that you could buy that have like flexible heads, which is really cool to get into the harder to get areas when you're building a system. Moving on from screwdrivers, the next tool that I would use would be a magnetized tray. Now, this allows me to keep the build organized. And when you're building a machine, you'll have a lot of screws that you'll have to mess around with. And this just allows me to have them all in one place and stationary. Once you add them here, they're not really going anywhere. And in the past, without this, when I've been building machines, I would always lose certain screws. They would just fall into black holes or into another dimension where I couldn't find them. But with this, it just makes my life much easier. And so I usually have one of these on hand when I'm building a computer. Now, this is not mandatory. It's a nice to have. If you don't want to put the money up for this, you could buy something like this, just a regular standard plastic tray that you could use to hold the screws that you're going to use for a build in one place, so that you don't have to look around and shuffle around to find screws. They would all just be stationary in one area. Moving on to the next tool, which would be a magnetizer. Now, these little things have two sections. One is to magnetize a bit and the other is to demagnetize a bit. Now, the reason why you would use one of these is because it allows you to magnetize one of the bits on your screwdriver head. So if I wanted to magnetize this, you would just put it through the magnetized section. I would wiggle it around a few times. And essentially, when you go to either put a screw into your system or take a screw out of your system, it'll stay magnetized to the bit head, which would help prevent you from losing screws. And that would overall just save you a lot of time and prevent a lot of headache when you're building a system. Chugging along, the next item I would use during a build would be cable ties. Now, cable ties are great for cable managing. So when you do a build, you'll have a bunch of cables all over the place, and this just allows you to organize those cables, to tie them down and put them in places where they're out of the way. Now, you don't have to buy cable ties to cable manage your system. You can just build a machine and leave the cables all over the place if you want, but I would advise against that because sometimes if you have a bunch of cables just all along, blocking sides of the case, you could be blocking airflow that would help cool the components inside of the system. So again, I would just advise against that, and I would just recommend cable tying everything to cable manage the wires. But another option would be kind of Velcro ties. I didn't want to buy those, so I just bought basic cable ties, but these are pretty much sufficient to cable manage cables inside of your system. Lastly, to finish off this section, I would also use a micro cutter, and this just allows me to cut the additional length off of a cable tie to keep everything looking clean inside of my build. Before I go over the components that I'll be using in this build, I do just want to be upfront that I did not put much thought into selecting these components. I really just wanted to gather compatible parts that fit a budget so that I could share my process that I've obtained in terms of building a custom machine. With that being said, let's jump into the first component. First up, I went ahead with an AMD Ryzen 7 5700X Zen 3 processor. This is going to be an 8-core 16-thread CPU, has a base clock of 3.4 GHz with a max boost of 4.6. This is going to be good for gaming, video editing, photo editing, streaming, so it's a good all-around CPU. And I got it on sale from Micro Center, which made it an easy pickup. For the GPU, I went with a Gigabyte RTX 4060. This is the Eagle Overclocked Edition. This is an 8 GB card. It's not a lot nowadays, but I got this on sale from Micro Center. It was open box. I do just want to bring to your attention though that currently there are tariffs in place, if you're not aware, that are affecting the pricing of GPUs and also their availability. So these are quite hard to find right now if you're looking to build a PC. So right now is not really a good time to build a computer, unfortunately. But if you're watching this in the future, hopefully all of that has died down and these are more available to find. For the RAM, I went ahead with G-Skill Trident Z Neo Memory. I find these to look very good aesthetically. I have them in my current build, but a different model, but same brand. These are going to be DDR4, 3600 megahertz. This is a 2x16 gigabyte kit. So this is 32 gigs, and it's going to have a CL rating of 16, which is going to pair nice with the 5700X AMD CPU. For the motherboard, I went ahead with an MSI B550M Pro VDH Wi-Fi motherboard. This has an AM4 socket, which is going to be compatible with the Ryzen 5700X that I have. Now, I did not have to do a BIOS update, thankfully. It just worked out of the box with that processor, but for some, you may have to update the BIOS on this board to get it to work with that CPU or that generation of CPUs. Now, this board has a good amount of connectivity on the back, has support for USB 3.2 Gen 1 connectivity, and it has some onboard video outputs. So if your processor supports onboard video, you can get video from the board, and it has an M.2 slot, has 2 of them. So found this to be a pretty decent board for the price. For the CPU cooler, I went ahead and picked up the tried and true Hyper 212 from Cooler Master. Now I went ahead with the Halo Black edition for the cooler. I just wanted to add a bit more RGB. The case includes RGB, but just wanted to get a little bit more with the cooler as well. Now I bought this cooler because the CPU itself does not include a heatsink. You have to buy your own, and so that's why I went ahead with the Hyper 212. Next up is going to be the operating system drive that I chose for this system, which is a Samsung 990 EVO Plus drive. This is a Gen 4 M.2 NVMe drive, and it's going to be capable of up to 7150 megabytes sequential reads, and then 6300 megabytes of write speeds. For the power supply, I went ahead with the Thermaltake Smart BX1 750 watt 80 plus Brungs unit. This power supply has all of the cables built into it. It's not modular, but that's completely fine. This unit has a 5-year warranty. Now for power supplies, I would recommend not cheaping out on these because you would risk it failing prematurely, which means that I can potentially take out another component with it, and that would be a disaster. So don't cheap out on these. Finally, for the case, I went ahead with the Montech X3 mesh version. This comes with RGB fans. It would have 6 of them that would be pre-wired. They're Molex, but that's why I didn't go ahead and buy separate individual fans because the case itself comes with them included. It has 3 in the front that are 140 millimeter. It has 2 at the top that are 120, and then it has 1 at the back that's also 120 as well. So another tip I would want to give you all is testing your parts before you fully build your machine, because the last thing you'd want to do is fully assemble your system and you find out that your motherboard is DOA. So it would be best practice to just go ahead and put everything together preemptively, to just stress test things or make sure it turns on, just to make sure that you don't have a DOA component with your build. In order to do this, you can actually just use the cardboard box method, which means that you can bench your board on top of the box that your motherboard came inside of. You don't want to use the bag because the bag itself is just anti-static on the inside, not on the outside. So when you're benching your board, make sure to just place it on top of the cardboard box itself. From there, you can plug in your CPU, you can plug in your GPU, your RAM, memory, your storage drive. Make sure to plug in a cooler for the CPU because it's going to get very hot when you're benching it. And then the connections for the power supply. You'll also need a keyboard and mouse to plug in, and you'll need an external monitor to get an image. But from there, you'll have to jump the board to get it to turn on. So to do that, I typically use something like a pin to go ahead and jump the power switch pins on the board to get it to turn on. And from there, you'll be able to get into the BIOS. Or like me, I would use something like a Windows to Go drive to boot into a portable Windows where I can stress test the computer. I have preloaded software on mine where I have just software that I could run on the CPU to stress test it, the GPU to stress test that. And so I have a way that I've developed to just bench everything and stress test everything before I put the system together. Another method would be using a metal bench. So those I use because they're much more secure. There's a lot of video cards out there that are massive nowadays, and so you don't want to just have those sitting freely in the motherboard without any support, because if they're leaning over with no support, they can easily damage the PCIe slot on the motherboard. So I use a metal bench to secure everything down to make it pretty safe to go ahead and do. And I feel confident in leaving it set up like that overnight to stress test the components for the system. Another thing that I would like to share is that you can test your power supply before you bench your motherboard using something like a power supply tester. You can test the primary connections for it, like the CPU power and the 24 pin. You can also test the SATA and Molex if you needed to, but this gives you a readout of the power supply pins, and it lets you know if everything is reading correctly in terms of it supplying the right amount of voltage. So these are pretty handy to have as well. Another cool thing to add on top of that would be a standalone power switch. So one of these can plug into your motherboard directly onto the power switch leads. And this would just allow you to easily power on your motherboard with just the press of a button. It acts like a regular power switch, instead of you having to use something metal to short out the two pins to get it to turn on or shut off. This would make it very easy to power on and off the motherboard when you're benching it. Now for the software that I'll have preloaded on my Windows to Go drive for test benching my components, I would have IDA64, which is a good memory and CPU tester. I would have OCCT, which is a good overall tester. It can test your GPU, your memory, your CPU, your power supply. I would also use Unigine Superposition, which is a good GPU benchmark and stress testing software. I would also have something like Cinebench for testing the CPU and benchmarking it as well. And I would use HW Monitor to monitor temps. And so I'll use all of those softwares to go ahead and stress test the system for 30 minutes to an hour. And if there's no issues, I would feel a lot more comfortable with proceeding with building the system, knowing that I've tested out each of the components. So now we've entered the fun part of the video, which is building the actual computer. But before we do that, I do just want to advise that you want to ground yourself, especially if you're in a highly static area. If you are, I would move to one that's not. If you're not in a highly static area, then I would still want to recommend grounding yourself. You can touch something that's metal, that's connected to the earth, such as a metal faucet or a radiator. I have my old computer case right next to me that's plugged into power still. So I'm just going to go ahead and touch that to ground myself before working on this system. And with that, let's go ahead and jump into building the computer. The first thing that I would start preparing for the build is the motherboard. So let's go ahead and take that and remove it from its box. It's going to be in an ESD bag, and we'll remove it from that. And once again, when you remove it from the bag, make sure to put the board on the cardboard box and not on top of the bag itself. All right, so once we have the motherboard out of the box, I would go ahead and start with installing the CPU. That's going to be the AMD Ryzen 7. So with this, there is a way to install it, and it's only one way to install it. Actually, there's not two ways, but on the CPU itself, if you look very closely at one of the corners, you'll notice that one of them have a triangle on it, and that triangle has to match up with the triangle that's on the motherboard AM4 slot or the CPU socket. And if you look closely at that, you'll see the corresponding triangle on the socket itself. And so that's how you'll know the correct orientation to install the CPU. So once you locate that on the CPU and the socket and you know the orientation, you'll have to pull the lever up to release the lever, and that would allow you to go ahead and basically align the CPU with the motherboard CPU socket to gently go ahead and install the CPU into it. You just want to drop it down in there very lightly and carefully, because you don't want to bend any of the pins that are on the CPU. Some CPUs don't have pins on them. They'll have it's all flat and the pins are on the board. But the overall goal is to not damage the pins, because if you do, they're nearly impossible to fix yourself. If it's a very light bent pin, you could probably fix it with something like a razor blade. But if you have like a whole row of pins bent, then unfortunately you're gonna have a really rough time trying to fix that. And the only route at that point would be to likely buy another CPU, because that would not be covered under warranty. But if you have the CPU installed correctly, you can go ahead and push down the lever to lock the CPU in place. And the next thing we'll move on to would be installing the RAM. So let's go ahead and grab the kit that I have, which would be the 2x16. And there is a way to install the memory as well. Again, only a way, there's not two ways. So to give you a tip, essentially on the bottom of the memory stick itself, there's going to be a gap in the row of contacts on it. And that gap has to match up with the gap that's on the motherboard RAM slot. And once you have those two aligned, you should be able to just align the ends of the RAM slot to go ahead and install the RAM. But before you do that, I want to mention that on the board itself, if you look very closely at it, it'll tell you where the first set of memory are to be installed. If you have a set of 4, you just populate all 4 of them. But if you only have a set of 2, then usually there's a set 2 combo of slots that you want to, or one set combo of slot that you want to install those 2 sticks of memory in. And usually you can look on the board itself, and it may be printed on the board where it shows you where those first 2 sticks would go. If you don't see it on the board, you can definitely check the manual, and it should show you there to let you know which would be the correct slots to install the 2 sticks of memory in. But once you know that, again, you would line that gap on the bottom of the memory up with the gap on the motherboard slot, or the notch on the memory slot on the motherboard. Release the levers for the slot and align the memory. Align the gap with the notch on the DIMM slot. So once you have them aligned on the ends, it should fall into place. And you're going to need a little bit of pressure to pop these into place. So I typically just use a thumb on one end and a thumb on another. Pop one end first, you'll hear a click, and that's just the lever reaching over onto the memory. And then same with the other end, push down, you'll hear a click, and that'll let you know that it's locked into place. And then you could go ahead and move on to the second stick. Same exact process. Release the levers, align the memory stick with the slot. Once you have it aligned, go ahead and push it down into the slot. Next up, we're going to install the M.2 Gen 4 NVMe drive that I have. So there's 2 slots on this motherboard. One is the Gen 4 and one is the Gen 3. The Gen 4 has the heatsink on top of it, which has a direct lane to the CPU. The secondary slot has a lane to the chipset, to the CPU. So we are going to install it into the Gen 4 slot because again, this is a Gen 4 drive. So same concept with the M.2 NVMe. There's going to be a notch on the drive that you want to align with the notch on the socket. But before we jump into that, let's go ahead and remove the heatsink from the M.2 slot. Typically it's 2 screws. I can't use my motorized. I'm going to use my manual or standard screwdriver, the Phillips head bit, to remove this. And these drives can get a bit hot, so you'll notice that there is again, a heatsink, but underneath it, it's going to be a thermal pad on it. And make sure to take off the film because you don't want to leave the film on. Once you have that removed, we can go ahead and align the M.2 with the notch on the M.2 socket or M.2 NVMe slot. Once you have it aligned, it doesn't really snap in or anything. It just slides into its port. And you're going to have to use the heat shield to basically keep the M.2 drive down. So once you have it in the slot, you have to put the shield on top of the slot, and then you would go ahead and screw it down with the 2 screws that it had. There's one, and then the secondary screw for the back. And that would be pretty much it. Now the M.2 drive is secured and we can move on to the next component. And that would be the CPU cooler. I typically install the CPU cooler after I've installed the RAM and the M.2 because usually those are located right below the cooler. And depending on how big the cooler is, it may block a slot or 2 for the RAM or potentially the M.2 slot. So I save this after I've installed those 2 first. And before we install this particular cooler, we do have to modify the bracket on the board itself. So for this motherboard, we're going to have to remove the built-in AM4 socket basic or included brackets. So just going to use the screwdriver that I have here to remove these. And I would recommend saving these because you never know, you might need these in the future again. So don't throw them away. Just make sure to store them somewhere just in case you might need them. Now, when you remove these 2 brackets, there is a bracket on the back of the board. And if you were to lift the board up, it would just fall out of place. So we're going to keep the board on the box and we're going to go ahead and install the brackets that we'll need to put on the CPU cooler itself. That would allow it to mount to the bracket on the back of the motherboard here. So these brackets came included with the cooler. The coolers, like if you buy a liquid cooler or an air cooler, they typically come with multiple brackets instead of the packaging because they'll usually be compatible with different sockets. So for this particular cooler, these are the correct AM4 brackets that we'll need to install to get it onto the board. So I'm just going to go ahead and run through that really quick. I'm not going to use the screwdriver because that actually makes a lot of noises in the video. So I'm just going to try to do this really quick to get this installed. All right, so I skipped ahead a little bit. I have the brackets installed onto the CPU cooler, but before we can install the cooler, we have to add thermal paste onto the CPU. Now, I'll be using MX4 thermal paste to apply onto my CPU. This is something that you'll likely need because sometimes your CPU cooler does not come with thermal paste pre-applied. Some do. So if yours doesn't, you'll have to buy it separately. So let's go ahead and apply it. Now, this is very controversial, but there's many methods to applying thermal paste to your CPU. I'm just going to use a simple method, which is I'm going to have a line just drawn across the CPU. So let's go ahead and do that and try to get it centered as much as possible. And I think that would be good. Now, the secret to this is you don't want to use too little because your CPU would not be able to cool properly. And you don't want to use too much, because if you use too much, then you risk the excess amount of thermal paste seeping over the CPU into the socket, which is something that you don't want to have happen. Because when you place the cooler on top and you start to screw it down to mount it, the pressure from the cooler is going to spread out the thermal paste, and if you have too much, it's going to spread over the CPU and start to seep into the socket, and that stuff is going to be impossible to clean out of the socket. But now that we have the CPU thermal paste installed, we can go ahead and mount the CPU cooler. Either direction is fine. It could be this way, it could be this way, but you just want to mount the cooler on top of the hose for the motherboard bracket. And once you have it aligned, you can go ahead and start screwing it down. And again, I'm not going to use the screwdriver during the video, so I'm just going to screw it down manually with my screwdriver. So a tip with this is to do it in across. So don't do 2 on the same side and 2 on the same side. You want to tighten down 1 and then go across, tighten down that one, but not fully. So you would tighten it down slightly, and then you move over to the next corner, screw that one a little bit down as well, and then do the same crisscross. You screw one side down on this end, and then you go over the other one, screw it down a little bit on this end. The reason that you would do it that way is because if you tighten one side down fully, it's going to be difficult to push down the other side to screw that one down. So basically, you do that to have the ability to screw every side of the cooler down pretty easily. So I'm just going to go ahead and tighten these, and that should be good. But you definitely want to make sure that it's screwed securely on each side to make sure that it's making proper contact with the CPU to properly cool it. So there is a fan that is included with this cooler, which would be this one. I'm not going to install it yet because I just want to save it for toward the end of the build. I think it just might get in my way, so I'll just install the fan for the cooler last. So the next step at this point is we're going to prep the case to get the motherboard installed inside of it. So for prepping the case, I would recommend taking off both side panels and the front panel as well, just so you don't scratch the machine when you're trying to build inside of it. The side panels are usually held in by screws, so you can just unscrew those. One panel might be toolless, where you could just remove it and take it off without having to unscrew anything. The front panel is typically clipped in, so you might have to use some force to pop those off, but be careful because there could be front panel attached to it. So just make sure that's not the case before you pull off the front panel from the chassis. Now at this stage, we're going to be installing the motherboard standoffs, and I would recommend laying the case flat for this. And for the standoffs, we're going to be installing additional ones because this chassis has some pre-installed. Yours might have them as well. And I'm going to remove the additional ones that I don't need. The reason why you want to remove the additional ones because the motherboard itself has pins that come out from underneath it. And if they make contact with those additional standoffs, you can cause a short and you'll have to replace your motherboard most likely. So we're going to go ahead and install those. I'll put those into the chassis. And then next after that, we'll install the IO shield on the back of the case. Also, for those of you who are unsure of where to put the standoffs for your chassis to install your board, I would usually recommend just taking your board, hovering it over your case to see where the holes on the board align with the holes on the chassis, so that you can have an idea of where would be the correct place to install the standoffs to mount your motherboard into your chassis. Next, since we have the standoffs installed, I would install the IO shield for the motherboard. The tip for this would be, I would recommend pushing these things that stick out on the IO shield upward and out of the way, because what can happen is when you install the IO shield, you put the board in and you're not paying attention, these can end up inside of the port. And for example, if one of them end up inside of the USB port, it can cause a short, and that might give you an error message such as overcurrent on the USB. And I found that sometimes it could be this that's causing that. So I usually push these up out of the way, and then I pop the IO shield in. You can pop it in using just your hand. Pop in one end, pop in the other. If you're having a hard time, you can use a flathead where you put the flathead into the grooves of the IO shield, and that'll allow you to help pop this into the chassis, because sometimes it could be a little difficult to do. But once you have the IO shield in, we can go ahead and proceed with installing the motherboard. Now for installing the motherboard, I would just recommend double checking that the standoffs are all in the right place and that you don't have any additional. Once you do that, we're going to go ahead and gently and easily drop the board into the case, and we're going to align it with the IO shield. Make sure you have the IO shield the right side up, and we're going to gently set it down on top of the standoffs. You don't want to drag the board across the standoffs because there are tiny little chips on the bottom of the board, and you don't want to accidentally scratch those off putting the board in. So just gently put the board in and try to sit it nicely on top of the standoffs that are inside the case. Once you have it aligned, you can go ahead and start screwing down the board to secure it to the chassis. Now, a tip that I want to mention here is if you're using a motorized screwdriver, I would recommend doing a couple of manual turns first with the screw into the board standoff to make sure that the screw is catching on to the standoff, because if you don't and you just start drilling and the screw is not in the thread of the standoff, what you risk doing is knocking off chips on the board, because the screw is just going to go into circles, and that may damage components on top of the board, and unfortunately, again, that would be considered physical damage. And if you start knocking off chips on the board, it's probably going to have issues. So just make sure that you do a couple of manual turns first, and then you screw down the screw. All right, so the next step is installing the power supply unit into the case. For this step, I would recommend standing the case upright, because you'll likely have to put the power supply in from the backside. Now, on the power supply itself, the power supply will have a fan on one side. That side, make sure that you don't block it, because if you do, it won't be able to cool itself. For this chassis, there's a grill at the bottom, which would allow the power supply to cool itself. So I'm going to go ahead and install the power supply with the fan facing downward. So for this portion, you just really want to move wires out of your way so the power supply doesn't get caught on them. And then you would just slide the power supply into the inside of the chassis. And once you do that, pretty much there's going to be 4 holes on the back that you have to align the power supply with. And once you have it aligned, you just get your screws and you go ahead and tighten them down into the power supply to secure it. Once the power supply is installed, the next step I would move on to is installing the power supply wiring and the front panel wiring. I typically bundle those two together. Now, this may be the scariest part for a lot of first-time builders, but there's really not that much to do if you have a simple build. You know, you'll have a lot of cables, which could be very intimidating. Like if you have a bunch of these wires, you're like, you know, what do I do with all of this? But if you have a very simple build, typically you just need the 24 pin for the board to power the motherboard. And then you would need either a 4 or 8 pin for the CPU to power that. And typically you would need a 6+2 pin in most cases, or maybe more, to power the graphics card unit, and that would pretty much be it if you're building a very simple build. Now, if you have a very high-end build, you'll obviously need to install more cables, but usually if it's a low-end build, you just need those 3 really, and maybe you might have to power a fan if it's a Molex like I do on this chassis. But other than that, it's pretty straightforward. But we'll first tackle the front panel wiring before we do the power supply wiring. For the front panel, usually you'll have a power switch, a reset switch, a hard drive LED, and a power LED that you'll have to install. And then you'll have audio and a couple of USB connectors that you have to install for the front panel as well. Now, in the front panel, a lot of people have trouble with this, especially people that are building their first computer. But I'm going to try to explain this as best I can. On the front panel, so for example, the power LED and the hard drive LED, if you look very closely at the connectors, you'll see a positive and a negative sign. So you want to make sure that you install these correctly. So the positive goes onto the positive pin, the negative goes onto the negative pin. And same thing for the hard drive LED. If you install these the wrong way, the LED for the power or the hard drive light will not work. So you want to make sure that you match up those correctly on the board. Usually you'll have a plus sign on the actual connection or a negative on the negative connection. And if you look closely at the board, I don't know if a lot of people notice, but if you look very closely at the board, most boards that I've worked on, they have a diagram printed on the board to show you where each exact one goes. So it'll show you where the positive goes, it'll show you where the negative goes for the power, and then same thing for the hard drive. Also, if you can't see it on there, you could check the manual, and the manual will tell you where exactly they should plug into. If they don't have like a plus and a negative on one side, on the back it might have a triangle to let you know which would be the positive. So the next thing would be, after you install those and you know where exactly they would go, you would go ahead with the power switch and the reset switch. Now the polarity on these two don't really matter as much as the hard drive LED and power LED. These could be plugged in either with the words facing up or facing down. The power switch and the reset switch just need to be connected to the pins in order to short them out. Just like what we did when we had the pin to power on the system, we just need to have those two sitting on top of those pins to short out the pins to go ahead and get them to react. So you can go ahead and plug these in whichever way. It's not a big issue with these two. Now I'm going to run through the remaining connections for the front panel. I have a HD audio, a USB 2.0, and a USB 3.0 remaining. The 3.0 connection is typically blue, and it's a rectangular connection, and it'll have a notch on the top that you can align with the motherboard corresponding 3.0 connector. You plug that in, you might have to like force it in a little bit, but make sure you have it aligned correctly because you could easily bend those pins. For the HD audio, this and the USB 2.0 kind of look the same in terms of the connection, but they're slightly different. The USB 2.0 has a missing pin on the corner, whereas the HD audio has a missing pin in the center. So you just find the corresponding pin or headers on the board and you plug those in. Make sure you just align the missing pins correctly, and then you plug in those two connections. Moving on to the power supply connections, I'm going to speed through this section as well. So we'll have to connect the 24 pin power into the board, and this will provide power to the motherboard essentially. It's only going to be able to go into the board one way, so you want to match it up or align it correctly. There's a lever on one side, and you can match that up with the notch on the motherboard 24 pin connection. Once you do that, you just push it down and it'll connect. For the CPU, we're going to go ahead and install the 8-pin power connector from the power supply. The connector on this power supply for the CPU, it's a 4+4 pin, but you can join those two together to make a 8-pin. Now, it's pretty much the same concept for the CPU connection. It has a locking lever on one side, and so you just want to match that locking lever up with the notch on the motherboard CPU slot. Once you do that, you can go ahead and just insert the CPU connection into the board. Now, I do also want to mention that I'm feeding all of these cables through the back side of the system to the front, because once we have all of these cables routed, we're going to go ahead and cable manage on the back side. For the last power connection from the power supply, that's going to be the PCIe for the graphics card. Now, the 4060 GPU that I have for this build, it requires a 8-pin. So I'm going to use the 6+2 pin connection from the power supply. I'm going to route this to the front. The GPU is not installed yet, but I'm just going to route this there so that when I do install the GPU, I have the power connection available to install. To install the GPU, we'll have to prep the case, which typically means removing the metal PCIe slots on the back of the case. Now, in order to figure out which slots you'll have to remove, you can use your GPU. So I would recommend just slowly lowering the GPU into the chassis. For this build, I'm going to be putting the GPU into the primary by 16 slot on this motherboard. And I can see that the first two PCIe slot covers would have to be removed. And once you're able to find out which ones have to be taken out, you would just have to go ahead and unscrew it or pop it out from the chassis. But for this case, I'm going to have to unscrew the two screws that hold those two in, and then a bracket that covers the PCIe slots as well. Once you have the graphics card PCIe slot covers removed, you can go ahead and start the install for the GPU. Now, before you do, the PCIe slot where the graphics card goes, you're going to have to release the lever on the back because that'll allow you to insert the GPU in. If it's in the lock position, it won't really, you'll have issues basically, but if you put it in the release position by pushing it down, it'll open it up. Now, you'll also, I'm just going to reiterate the same thing that I've mentioned before for the RAM and the M.2. The graphics card has a gap on the connector, and if you look very closely at the motherboard where the GPU goes into the PCIe slot, there's a notch in the slot as well. So you have to match the gap on the connector on the GPU with the notch in the PCIe slot on the motherboard. And we'll go ahead and lower the GPU slowly into the system, and you have to align it with the PCIe slot covers on the back. Once you align it and you have it into the PCIe slot, you just want to go ahead and insert it. After you've verified that you can see the notches lining up, you can just go ahead and push it down into the PCIe slot, and you'll hear a click from the PCIe slot lever when it clicks onto the GPU. Now that I have the graphics card installed inside of the case, I'm going to go ahead and add the screws to secure it down to the chassis. I'm also going to go ahead and plug in that PCIe power cable that I ran from the power supply into the GPU. And that would pretty much complete the install of the graphics card. The next thing that I'm going to do is install the CPU fan on the cooler, and I'm going to run through that really quickly. The CPU fan has special brackets that install into it that would allow it to mount onto the CPU cooler. And they really just got to be expanded in order for it to mount into the fins on the cooler. Once you have it mounted, you have to connect the 4-pin fan connector, and that's going to go into the CPU port on the motherboard. And then it comes with a RGB connection as well. It's a 3-pin addressable RGB. And this motherboard has a connector for it, so I'm just going to go ahead and plug it into that connector. And that's pretty much it for the cooler install, or completing the cooler install. Next, I'm going to go ahead and manage the cables inside the chassis. Flipping the case over, I'm going to go ahead and add the power for the fans. They all take a single Molex power connector from the power supply. Since I have that connected, I'm going to go ahead and start doing the cable management. One tip that I want to give here is keep in mind that you're going to have to put the side panel back on. So you want to make sure everything is flush enough that you'll be able to get the panel back onto the side of the chassis. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and speed through the cable managing of the chassis, and I'll just show you all the finished look. That is it for this video. I do appreciate you for watching. Hopefully you found it useful, entertaining, and informative. I put a lot of time and dedication into this to try to make it as informative as possible. I did want to add additional stuff like configuring the BIOS, loading Windows, and doing some gaming, some benchmarking, but had to put a cap on this one. If you are interested in a part 2, please do let me know in the comment section below. Maybe I'll go ahead and put that out. But you all have a great one, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.